On the threshold of Europe, where the known world ended, stood a city that was a living myth, Constantinople. Its walls, the most formidable ever conceived by the hand of man, had been the shield of Christendom for 1,000 years, a bulwark against which countless armies and ambitions had shattered. But in the spring of 1453, a new and terrible sound thundered across the plain, an artificial thunder that shook the very foundations of history. It was the voice of a bronze monster, a cannon of apocalyptic dimensions created for a single purpose: to tear down the unbreachable. The air smelled of gunpowder and destiny, and each impact against the millennial stone was not just an attack, but the hammer blow forging the end of one era and the bloody birth of another. An empire that at its zenith was the center of the universe, the direct heir to the glory of Rome, was now but a ghost confined to a single city. An emperor with a lineage of Caesars ruled over little more than churches and relics, an old lion surrounded by hyenas. Outside, camped before its gates, was the largest and most advanced army on the planet, a human tide of 80,000 souls led by a 21-year-old sultan whose ambition burned with the fire of prophecy. Inside, barely 7,000 men, an unlikely brotherhood of Byzantines, Genoese, and Venetians, prepared to face the apocalypse. They were the last line of defense, the last breath of an empire that refused to die in silence. This is not merely the chronicle of how Constantinople fell. That is a story of inevitability, of numbers, and of gunpowder. This is the saga of what happened during 53 days of infernal siege. It is the story of how an emperor doomed to extinction and a handful of warriors defied logic, mathematics, and the devil himself. They did not seek to survive. They sought glory and defiance. They did not fight for victory, which they knew was impossible, but to engrave upon the memory of time a testament of courage. This is the legend of how 7,000 men, against all odds, stood firm before the greatest force of their time, and, before falling, forced a giant to bleed, to doubt, and to pay a price in blood for every inch of sacred ground. At the heart of the dying city stood its emperor, Constantine V Palaiologos. He was neither a tyrant nor a saint, but a profoundly pragmatic man, crushed beneath the weight of 1,500 years of Roman history. His melancholic eyes saw the truth with brutal clarity. He ruled a phantom empire, a glorious relic whose domains barely extended beyond its walls. He knew that aid from the West was an empty promise and that his fate was sealed. But within him burned the flame of his ancestors, the Caesars. He fought not for victory, but for honor. His motivation was not to survive, but to die as the last emperor of the Romans, sword in hand, defending the final fragment of a legacy that had shaped the world, ensuring that the end of Rome would be an epic, not a whisper. At his side, a counterpoint of steel and pragmatism, was Giovanni Giustiniani Longo, a Genoese mercenary, a condottiero whose reputation preceded him. He was the tactical brain of the defense, a master in the art of poliorcetics, siegecraft, and fortification. He was not there for loyalty to a dying empire or for religious fervor. He was there for glory. Constantinople represented the ultimate challenge, the opportunity to inscribe his name in history by facing the most powerful army on earth with a ridiculously inferior force. While Constantine embodied the tragic soul of the resistance, Giustiniani was its lethal mind. His genius for defensive engineering, his charisma in leading a multicultural troop, and his tireless energy were the true pillar upon which the city's impossible defense rested. Opposite them, in a tent of silk and gold, surrounded by maps and counselors, a 21-year-old man watched the city with an obsession that bordered on madness. He was Sultan Mehmed II, an intellectual prodigy, a brilliant strategist, and a man consumed by a single ambition: to conquer the Red City, the Golden Apple, and fulfill the prophecy of the Prophet Muhammad. Mehmed was no barbarian. He spoke multiple languages, studied the campaigns of Alexander and Caesar, and understood that conquest was not merely an act of force, but of intellect and will. He saw the walls not as a barrier, but as a riddle to be solved. His youth was not a weakness, but his greatest weapon. It gave him a boldness and an impatience for glory that his more cautious predecessors never had. He was willing to do anything to claim his prize. To this end, Mehmed had assembled a force that dwarfed the city. 80,000 regular soldiers, among them the feared Janissaries, the most disciplined and lethal elite infantry in the world, torn from their Christian families as children and forged into the perfect Islamic war machine. To them were added tens of thousands of irregular troops and a vast naval fleet that choked the Bosphorus. But his true ace in the whole was technological, an overwhelming superiority in the field of artillery. Its centerpiece was a bronze monstrosity forged by the Hungarian engineer Orban, a supercannon nicknamed the Basilica, capable of spitting projectiles weighing over 500 kilograms. Mehmed did not come to besiege the city. He came to pulverize it, convinced that his firepower would render 1,000 years of defensive history obsolete. The battlefield was, in itself, a central character in this drama. Constantinople was a natural fortress, a peninsula protected by the sea on 3 of its flanks. But its true defensive glory lay on its landward side, the legendary Theodosian walls. They were not a single wall, but a sophisticated killing machine nearly 6.5 kilometers long. It consisted of a 3-layered system. First, a wide, deep moat, then a lower outer wall, bristling with towers, and finally, the inner wall, a colossal barrier 12 meters high and 5 meters thick, with towers soaring up to 20 meters. This structure was designed to break the momentum of any assault, funneling attackers into kill zones where they would be annihilated by crossfire from all angles, turning the Ottoman numerical superiority into a useless and vulnerable mass. Faced with this monumental challenge, the genius of Giovanni Giustiniani devised the only possible strategy, an elastic defense. He knew he could not defend every meter of the wall, so he concentrated his scarce elite troops at the most critical points, moving them swiftly to counter threats. His plan was not to passively await the impact, but to lead an active and brutal defense. When Mehmed's cannons opened a breach during the day, Giustiniani personally led nighttime counterattacks under a rain of fire to repair the walls with earth, wood, and rubble. He used the Byzantine artillery with surgical precision, not to engage the super cannons, but to destroy the costly Ottoman siege engines. Every day was a race against time, a deadly dance between destruction and reconstruction. The stage is set. The armies are about to clash in one of the most decisive battles in history. To not miss a second of this epic confrontation, subscribe to the channel and activate notifications, because the storm of steel and blood is about to be unleashed. On April 20th, after 2 weeks of incessant bombardment that had begun to open the first wounds in the walls, the defenders' morale was at rock bottom. Hunger was beginning to set in, and the Ottoman naval blockade was absolute, suffocating any hope of aid. It was then that, on the horizon of the Sea of Marmara, a miracle appeared. 4 Christian ships, 3 Genoese and 1 Byzantine, loaded to the brim with grain and reinforcements. They were a speck of dust against the immense Ottoman armada of over 100 vessels that controlled the waters. For Sultan Mehmed, this was not a threat, but an insolence that had to be crushed publicly to definitively break the city's spirit. He ordered his admiral to intercept and sink them in full view of all. The battle that followed was a spectacle of pure naval skill versus brute force. The Christian ships, taller and more robust, grouped together in a hedgehog formation, a nearly impenetrable floating castle. The Ottoman fleet, composed of lower, faster galleys, swarmed them in a furious frenzy, but they could not board the high enemy decks. The Genoese and Byzantine sailors, masters of naval combat, repelled one attack after another with iron discipline, using Greek fire, crossbows, and a determination born of desperation. From the walls of Constantinople, the emperor and the entire population watched in agonizing silence, praying as the fate of their city hung by a thread in that deadly dance upon the waves. It was a fight of David against Goliath, a display of courage that paralyzed 2 armies. Finally, aided by a favorable shift in the wind, the 4 ships achieved the impossible. They broke the Ottoman line and, battered but victorious, sailed into the safety of the Golden Horn. The explosion of jubilation on the walls was a thunder of relief and pride that reached the Ottoman camp. The humiliation for Mehmed was total and public. He had been defeated in his own element by a handful of ships. This unexpected triumph injected a vital dose of morale into the defenders. It showed them that the Ottoman giant was not invincible, that it could be wounded, that it could be outwitted. The resistance hardened. Hope, which had seemed dead, was furiously resurrected. The naval victory proved that spirit, at times, could outweigh steel. The humiliation at sea only served to harden Mehmed's resolve. His frustration focused on a single obstacle that neutralized his naval power, a gigantic iron chain that the Byzantines had stretched across the entrance to the Golden Horn, the city's natural harbor. Behind that barrier, the small Italo-Byzantine fleet rested securely, and one of the most vulnerable sections of the walls remained beyond the reach of his ships. For days, his admirals tried to break the chain without success. The Sultan's frustration turned into a feverish obsession. If he could not pass through the water, he would find another way. It was then that he conceived a plan so audacious it bordered on madness, a feat of engineering and will that would leave the world stunned. On April 22nd, under the cover of night, Mehmed set his incredible plan in motion. He ordered thousands of his men to build a road of wooden rollers, smeared with animal fat, for over 1.5 miles, up and down the hill of Galata. Then, using the combined strength of men and oxen, he began to transport 70 of his warships overland. It was a surreal vision, a fleet sailing over forests and hills. The defenders of Constantinople heard the noises during the night but could not imagine the scale of the undertaking. To them, the idea of moving an armada over land was simply unthinkable, a fantasy. But Mehmed's will turned fantasy into a terrible reality. At dawn, the horror became apparent. The defenders awoke to see the impossible. The Ottoman fleet, which the night before had been outside the harbor, was now floating inside the Golden Horn, in their backyard. The psychological blow was devastating. The chain, their anchor of security, had become useless. Suddenly, a new and extensive section of walls, less formidable than the land walls, was exposed to a naval assault. Constantine XV was forced to divert his already scarce and exhausted soldiers to defend this new front, stretching his lines to the breaking point. Mehmed's demented genius had once again tightened the noose around the city's neck, proving that his imagination was as powerful a weapon as his cannons. After weeks of failed assaults and relentless bombardment, Mehmed decided to risk everything. On May 29th, before dawn, he launched the final assault. First, he sent in the irregular troops, the Bashi bazooks, a wave of cannon fodder to exhaust the defenders. They were massacred. Then he sent in the regular Anatolian troops, who were also repelled by the suicidal courage of Giustiniani's men. Finally, when the defenders were at the limit of their physical and mental endurance, Mehmed unleashed his ultimate weapon, the Janissaries. They advanced with terrifying discipline in almost complete silence, ignoring casualties, a white tide of death that crashed against the most weakened section of the wall, the Lycus Valley. The true battle for Constantinople had begun. At the epicenter of this storm of steel and fire was Giovanni Giustiniani Longo. For hours, he and his elite men fought like demons in the breach, in hand-to-hand combat of indescribable brutality. He was the soul, the heart, and the brain of the defense. His presence was a beacon of hope. Where he fought, the line held. He inspired Byzantines, Venetians, and his own Genoese alike, uniting the desperate garrison with his example of valor and tactical expertise. As long as Giustiniani stood, the wall, though broken, would not fall. He had become a symbol of the impossible resistance, a legend being forged in real time amidst the chaos of the final battle. Then, at the climax of the fight, when the balance seemed impossibly poised, fate dealt its cruelest blow. A projectile, possibly from a small cannon or an arquebus, pierced Giustiniani's armor, gravely wounding him. The pain and loss of blood were unbearable. The man who had been the rock of the defense collapsed. His men, in shock, carried him from the front line to seek medical attention, taking him through a small gate to the safety of the city. His withdrawal, though understandable, was the catalyst for disaster. At the most critical moment of the battle, the leader had vanished. The void he left on the wall was not just physical, it was a psychological abyss that swallowed the defenders. Morale. Giustiniani's absence was felt instantly. The chain of command shattered. The soldiers, seeing their invincible commander being evacuated, assumed the worst. Panic, a swift and lethal poison, began to spread through the ranks. The Janissaries, expert predators in sensing fear, perceived the shift immediately. They redoubled their assault with renewed ferocity, smelling victory. The resistance, which had been a coordinated and heroic defense, began to crumble into isolated pockets of desperate struggle. The men who had fought shoulder to shoulder for 53 days suddenly felt alone and abandoned, fighting no longer for the city, but for their own lives in a tide that was finally drowning them. While chaos engulfed the main breach, luck sealed the city's fate elsewhere. A small postern gate in the wall, the Kirkeporta, used for nighttime raids, had been left unlocked in a fatal oversight amidst the confusion of the assault. A small detachment of Ottoman soldiers, scouting the base of the wall for a weak point, stumbled upon this incredible opportunity. Without hesitation, they slipped through the gate, found themselves inside the defensive perimeter, and met no resistance. It was a stroke of luck so improbable it seemed a divine or diabolical intervention. The history of a 1,500-year-old empire was about to end because of a forgotten bolt. The small group of Ottomans wasted no time. They climbed to the top of the inner wall, killed the few defenders they found, and, in an act that would change the world, raised the Ottoman standard atop a tower. The sight of that enemy flag, flying not outside but inside the walls, was the psychological death sentence for the resistance. The cry spread like wildfire among the defenders. "The Turks are inside!" The backbone of the defense shattered into 1,000 pieces. Organized fighting ceased entirely. The battle became a desperate flight, and for the Ottomans, a hunt. The collapse was total, instantaneous, and catastrophic. The main gates were opened from within, and Mehmed's army poured into the city like an unstoppable flood. The fall of the city unleashed a 3-day hell of plunder, a brutal violence that stood in bitter contrast to the epic and noble defense that had preceded it. The streets that had witnessed the last stand of Rome became rivers of blood. The price of resistance was terrible. Of the approximately 7,000 men who had defended the walls, it is estimated that more than 4,000 fell in the final combat. They were annihilated to the last man in the breaches or hunted down in the streets. Those who did not die were enslaved, along with tens of thousands of civilians. The silence that followed the battle was not of peace, but the silence of a graveyard, the empty echo of an empire that had been erased from the map in a matter of hours. In the midst of the carnage, the last Caesar of Rome met his end. Constantine V, Palaiologos, was last seen in the breach, having cast off his imperial insignia so as not to be recognized and captured. With his sword in hand, he threw himself into the Ottoman tide alongside his last loyal soldiers, choosing to die not as an emperor on his throne, but as a common soldier defending his home. His body was never certainly identified, absorbed into the anonymity of the massacre. His fate became legend, a fittingly ghostly end for the last heir of a lineage stretching back to Augustus. There was no surrender, no exile. The last Roman emperor died with his empire, his tomb the very city he had sworn to defend to the death. Mehmed's victory was absolute, but the price he paid for it was exorbitant. Although exact figures are impossible to determine, Ottoman casualties were immense, with some sources suggesting tens of thousands of dead and wounded over the 53-day siege. His best troops, including thousands of janissaries, fell before the tenacity of the defenders. The city had not been an easy prize. It had fought with the ferocity of a cornered lion and had extracted a pound of flesh for every stone toppled. Mehmed had conquered the greatest city in the world, but the near-suicidal resistance of Constantine and Giustiniani had shown him and the rest of the world that the legacy of Rome would not be extinguished without first inflicting a deep and bloody wound upon its conqueror. Politically, the fall of Constantinople was an earthquake that redrew the map of the world. It marked the definitive and unequivocal end of the Roman Empire, an institution that, in its various forms, had existed for nearly 1,500 years since the founding of Rome. It was more than the fall of a city. It was the extinction of a civilization that had laid the foundations of Western law, politics, architecture, and culture. For Christian Europe, the news was an apocalyptic shock. The great shield that had protected them for centuries had been shattered, and now the gate to Europe was wide open, exposed to the ambition of a new and formidable power rising in the east, with its sights set on Vienna and Rome. The conquest consolidated the Ottoman Empire as the dominant superpower in the eastern Mediterranean and the Balkans. For Sultan Mehmed II, it was the culmination of his destiny, the achievement that earned him the title Fatih, the Conqueror. The city, renamed Istanbul, became the new and glorious capital of a burgeoning Islamic empire that would become the center of the world for the next several centuries. The Hagia Sophia, the heart of Orthodox Christendom for 1,000 years, was converted into a mosque, a powerful and enduring symbol of the shift in power. Mehmed's victory not only gave him a strategic capital, but also immense legitimacy as the greatest champion of Islam. One of the most profound and far-reaching consequences of the fall of Constantinople was, ironically, the dawn of a new age for Europe. With the traditional overland trade routes to Asia now firmly under the control of an often hostile Ottoman Empire, European nations were forced to seek alternatives. This economic necessity became the primary catalyst for the Age of Discovery. Maritime powers like Portugal and Spain invested massively in the search for new sea routes to India and the East Indies, sailing south around Africa and eventually west across the Atlantic. Mehmed's conquest, designed to project his power, ended up pushing his European rivals toward a new world, unleashing globalization. Over time, the siege became a foundational myth for both sides. For the Turkish world, it is the defining moment of glory, the prophesied and just conquest that established their empire and proved the superiority of their faith and military might. Mehmed the Conqueror is a national hero. For the West, the story was transformed into a legend of tragic heroism, a cautionary tale of Christian disunity in the face of an existential threat. The last stand of Constantine V became the archetype of the noble struggle against insurmountable odds, the fall of the last bastion of ancient Rome in a final battle so epic and desperate that its echo resonates even today as a testament to the indomitable human spirit in the face of an inevitable fate. The chief architect of Mehmed's victory, the man who provided the key to unlock the impregnable city, was a Hungarian cannon engineer named Orban. He was a master of his craft, a mercenary of technology whose loyalty belonged to no crown or faith, but to the highest bidder. His masterpiece, the Basilica, was a bronze Leviathan, the largest cannon the world had ever seen, a revolutionary siege weapon designed for a single purpose: to turn the walls that had defied all armies for a millennium into rubble. Orban was the herald of a new era of warfare, where gunpowder and engineering weighed more than stone and courage, and his destructive genius was the instrument Mehmed used to make history. But herein lies the most bitter and cruel irony of this story, the final detail that encapsulates the tragedy of Constantinople. Before selling his services and his monstrous cannon to Sultan Mehmed, Orban had first offered his creation to Emperor Constantine V. The engineer presented the emperor with the opportunity to possess the most powerful weapon in the world, one that could have shattered the Ottoman siege train and perhaps saved the city. But the Byzantine Empire was a shadow of its former wealth. Its coffers were empty. Constantine, with a heavy heart, had to refuse the offer. He simply could not afford it. The fate of a 1,500-year-old empire was sealed not by faith nor by strategy, but by the cold, mundane price of metal. The very weapon that destroyed the walls could have been the one to save them.